I would like to show you the best game of the 1968 Candidates Quarterfinal Match between Boris Spassky and Efim Geller. The game was played in the round 6 of the match and Spassky played the Closed Sicilian. This opening had already been played in rounds 2 and 4, and in both of those games Geller got better positions after the opening. In this game, however, Spassky dramatically improved the variation and played ideal chess. While Geller's pieces were on the queenside, Spassky demolished his opponent's kingside by means of vicious sacrifices, creating an attacking masterpiece. Spassky started with e4, Geller played the Sicilian defense, and instead of a common knight f3 and d4, Spassky opted for the closed Sicilian, knight c3. d6, g3, of course in the closed Sicilian white fianchettos the bishop, knight c6, bishop g2, g6. Black does the same, black is going to fianchetto the bishop and exert very unpleasant pressure on the long diagonal and control the very important dark squares in the center. d3, bishop g7, f4. White plays actively on the king side, creating threats on the king side in the closed Sicilian, while black is going to play on the queen side, advancing the pawns on the queen side, trying to open the files and create weaknesses on this part of the board. And Geller played knight f6. In his interview after the match, he admits that knight f6 isn't so effective. And he came to this conclusion after the match. Instead, it would have been better to play e6, followed by knight e7, so that the knight doesn't block the f-pawn. And after white plays h3, g4, and as soon as white is ready to play f5, which would be dangerous for black, black would prevent it by playing f5 himself. But after knight f6, the knight is blocking the f-pawn, and now this plan would be problematic. But still, it's perfectly playable. Knight f3, castles, castles, rook b8. So black is going to play b5 followed by b4, attacking the knight. In the second round of this match, this position already arose, and in that game Spassky moved his knight to h4. However, Spassky didn't get any advantage. On the contrary, as the knight moved from f3, from the square from which it controlled very important squares, Geller managed to seize the initiative. He centralized his knights and got a better position. In this game, instead of knight h3, Spassky improved the variation and played h3 instead, preparing the g4 advance and also ensuring the bishop's position on e3, so that the knight cannot harass the bishop from g4. Geller plays b5. Geller plays straightforwardly in this game. b5, followed by b4, of course. And Spassky played a3. It's not recommended, actually, to move the pawns on that side of the board on which your opponent is stronger and on which your opponent is advancing the pawns. However, in this position, a3 makes perfect sense, because if Spassky didn't play a3 and played straightforward bishop e3 instead, then after b4, knight e2, knight d7, opening the bishop's diagonal, attacking the pawn, rook b1, defending it, and queen a5, the defense of the a2 pawn would have been problematic. That's why Spassky plays a3. And Geller plays a5, renewing the threat of b4. And of course there is nothing white can do against it. White plays bishop e3. And b4, 8 takes b, 8 takes b, knight e2, bishop b7, connecting the rooks and the queen. And black is going to play rook a8 and occupy the a file. In round 4, in this position, Spassky played queen d2. But after rook a8, he had to avoid the exchange of the rooks, of course, because in order to carry out a successful attack on the king side, white has to keep as many pieces on board as possible. And for this reason, Spassky played rook b1, so that the rook defends the pawn, because black is going to move the knight sooner or later, and the pawn would become a target of attack. But later in that game, he played b3, and when the c2 pawn was attacked from a2, the rook had to make the second move to c1 in order to defend the pawn. But Spassky, in this game, again, he improved the variation, and instead of queen d2, he plays b3, moving the pawn away from b2, from the square on which it would become the target of attack. And after rook a8, he, without spending a tempo for rook b1, as in the game 4, he plays rook c1 without losing a tempo. So the main weakness white has on the queenside is the c2 pawn, of course. Actually the only weakness. And the rook is defending it. And now all the other pieces will concentrate on the attack of the king side. Rook a2, attacking the pawn, but it is protected. So Spassky continues his pawn storm on the king side, g4. And Geller plays queen a8, which is a dubious move. Queen moves too far away from the king side, which will be fatal, as you will see. And besides that, it would have been much better to move the second rook on a8. And this was suggested by Geller himself. So instead of queen a8, it would have been better to play queen a5. And after queen e1, so white of course wants to play queen h4, moving the queen closer to the king side, but queen b5, preventing queen h4 because of simple tactics. After queen h4, knight takes e4 would follow, and after d takes e, queen takes e2, and also with tempo opening the second rook way, so moving away from a5, so that the queen doesn't stand between the two rooks. And after queen f2, as queen h4 doesn't work, queen f2, rook a8. The rooks are connected, and black is going to play rook a1 and exchange the both rooks, after which f5 wouldn't be so dangerous. But instead of all this, Geller played queen a8, and now the connection of the two rooks would be problematic. Of course, it wouldn't work. Queen e1 threatening queen h4, queen a6 preventing queen h4 for the same tactics. After queen h4, simply knight takes e4 and queen takes e2. That's why after queen a6, Spassky played queen f2 and knight a7. So Geller's plan is simple. Knight b5, so he prepared the knight maneuver, and knight a3, attacking the pawn for the second time. However, this knight maneuver takes a lot of time, it's too slow. Besides that, the knight on c6 was controlling very important central squares, and it was close to the center. But after it moves to a3, as you see, the queen, the bishop, the rook are already far away from the king side, and the knight moves away from the king side too, while almost all white pieces are on the king side, and just the bishop and the knight wouldn't be sufficient defensive resource of the king side. So knight a7. Instead of knight a7, it would have been better to play knight d7. But Geller played knight a7. And now that black pieces are distracted on the queen side, Spassky starts his attack. f5, crossing the center of the board. Knight b5. Geller continues his straightforward play on the queen side. F takes g, h takes g, and knight g5, threatening queen h4, creating deadly threats on h7. Of course, the knight is defending h7, but after queen h4, the rook's file will be open, and white would threaten simply to sacrifice the exchange, eliminate the defender of h7, and simply checkmate on h7. Geller continues his straightforward play. Knight a3, attacking the pawn on c2 for the second time. Queen h4, now black doesn't have time to capture because of simply rook takes f6. That's why Geller plays rook c8, vacating the f8 square, the escape square for the king. However, so that after rook takes f6, queen h7 isn't the checkmate. However, Spassky still sacrifices the exchange, eliminating one of the main defenders of the king side. The bishop, together with the knight, were the only two defenders of the king side. As you see, all black pieces are placed on the queen side. So Spassky eliminates one of the main defenders, and as you see, white pieces are very close to the kingside, so he starts a deadly attack. Of course, black cannot capture the rook with the bishop because of checkmate in 2 moves. That's why Geller captures with a pawn. And queen h7 check, king f8. So, what to do now? How to continue the attack? Spassky found a very effective way. You can pause the video and try to find his next move. So he sacrifices his knight, which is currently under attack, and completely demolishes the kingside. Knight takes f7. Now the pawn on g6 is also unguarded. The f7 pawn was defending it, but now g6 pawn will also fall. So in case king takes f7, if black accepts the sacrifice, then simply bishop h6, threatening to capture the bishop, which is pinned, and after rook g8, defending the bishop, knight f4, and now the g6 pawn is attacked twice and there is nothing black can do to defend it. And after rook takes c2, black finally captures this pawn on c2, a very strong move, rook f1. And the rook also joins the attack. And black's position simply collapses. Kasparov, in his great predecessors, gives the following variation. For example, if g5, the pawn would fall anyway, so at least black is attacking the knight, then queen g6 check. Now, if king f8, then of course queen takes f6, because the bishop is pinned. That's why king e7, but then bishop takes g7, g takes f, bishop takes f6 check, king d7, queen takes g8, so white returns the sacrificed material, and after queen takes d3, queen f7 check, white simply exchanges the queens, and this endgame, of course, is winning for white because white has 2 connected passed pawns, and the bishops control these squares of the advance of the pawns, and there is nothing black can do in order to stop the advance. Besides that, black doesn't have any chances of creating passed pawns. These passed pawns would be absolutely wouldn't create any danger because both bishops control the squares of the advance of these pawns. Besides that, the f4 pawn also falls. So in this endgame is absolutely winning for white. That's why after knight takes f7, Geller didn't capture the knight, but finally captures the c2 pawn. And Spassky makes another strong move. Bishop h6. So all pieces move closer and closer to the black king. Now, if rook takes e2, then simply queen takes g7 check, and knight g5. That would be simply deadly for black. After f takes g, simply bishop takes g5, and there is nothing black can do in order to defend against the checkmate. Neither of black pieces can do anything in order to prevent the checkmate, because all of them are placed on the queen side. So that's why after bishop h6, Geller captures the rook, and knight takes c1, of course. Now, Geller plays king takes f7. Now he captures the knight. Instead, if he captured the bishop, then a beautiful variation would have followed. Knight takes h6, threatening checkmate on f7. The pieces are useless. Pieces cannot do anything to prevent it. The only move is king e8, but knight g8, again threatening checkmate. And again, there is nothing pieces can do to prevent it. The only move is king f8, but now knight e7, and followed by knight takes g6 check, and queen e7 checkmate after king e8. That's why after knight takes c1, Geller captures the knight. But now, of course, the bishop falls with check. Now, if king moves to e8, that would be even worse than what happened in the game. After g5, threatening to capture on f6, or maybe even with a pawn. And after f takes g, bishop takes g5, threatening checkmate, and rook e8 to prevent checkmate, a strong move, h4, and the bishop joins the attack with great effect, threatening checkmate in one move. That's why, of course, king e8 followed. But now g5, and if f takes g, then simply bishop takes g5, and again there is nothing black can do against the checkmate. That's why Geller played f5, but now, of course, the pawn is very advanced and the g6 pawn falls, and there is nothing black can do against the advance of the pawn. So Spassky captures on g6 with tempo, check, king d7, queen f7, check, king c6, and e takes f, opening the bishop's diagonal, and check. Now, when the king moves, white simply exchanges everything on b7 and plays f6, and there is nothing black can do in order to stop the advance of the pawns, and white will simply promote to queen. That's why after e takes f check, Geller resigned. And now I recommend watching an attacking masterpiece created by a great theoretician Isaac Lipnitsky, in which he sacrificed a pawn and a piece in order to completely paralyze his opponent's kingside and carry out a deadly attack. But first, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.